How's it going, everyone? We are back with another Lifetime Power Rankings, and I apologize it's taken so long for me to post up another video. This past month, I actually had a baby, and so I understandably took some time off to focus on that. But now that I'm back, we're going to be able to focus a little bit more on some videos and hopefully be able to get out some content for you. And what better way to do it than jumping into the NHL this time? We've already talked about the NFL lifetime power rankings, my Major League Baseball lifetime power rankings, and I did start working on this video right when the Stanley Cup Finals ended, but because life happened, it's just taken me a long time to get this out. I'm going to stick with the same format as I did last time, where we have kind of more of a casual podcast type format and be able to just talk with you and share my thoughts on each of these teams. The NHL is pretty interesting and it has grown the most in my lifetime over the past 30 years. If you can believe it, I guess, Major League Baseball, NFL, basketball, they've had, 4 or 5 expansion teams throughout the past 30 years. Hockey has had 11, if you can believe that. And even more crazy is that back when I was born, 16 of those 21 teams still made the playoffs. So if you didn't make the playoffs in the early 90s, there was something wrong with you. And you'll see that maybe reflected in some of the older franchises having a little bit more success. But again, let's talk about again what my rankings are and how I calculate them. So, a project I've been working on since I was just a little kid. It's something that I've just enjoyed doing is just determining what have been the most dominant franchises of my lifetime. And it's something that I just update every single season and I reward and these points based on how they perform. You can call them franchise points, dynasty points. I kind of go back and forth between them, but I allocate them based on performance. So let's just give a quick summary on how I do that. It's very similar to baseball and football, but because they play a different amount of games, the point values will be a little bit different. So the way it works is I reward 1 point for each victory. I reward half a point for a tie. Back in the 90s, they actually had ties. Or I reward half a point for an overtime loss as well. And then I reward uh, 10.25 points for a playoff appearance and 20.5 points for a division title. And then something that is unique to hockey and something that I did want to showcase here is that they have what is called a President's Trophy. And what that means is that's just the team that had the best point value throughout the entire season. So basically, the best performing team in the regular season was given the President's Trophy as the best team. And so for that, I actually am going to give 30.75 points for each President's Trophy, and then 41 points for making it to the Stanley Cup Finals, and then 82 points for a Stanley Cup victory. So again, very similar to the format that a Stanley Cup victory is equal to the same as going undefeated throughout the entire regular season. So that way we place a little bit more emphasis on your franchise and legacy, which is performing in the playoffs. And last, before we jump right into it, let's talk a little bit again about the expansion rule that I do have, because it's going to play a big factor in these rankings. So with the other rankings, like I did before, because the way that these points work, obviously the longer you've been a franchise, the more chances you have of accumulating these franchise points, which leaves some of our expansion teams who joined after I was born at a disadvantage. So the way that I work with these other expansion teams is that I take their per year average and then I multiply that by how many seasons that have happened in my lifetime. Hockey is crazy. Let me just say that because first of all, we have so many expansion teams. There's such good legacy and tradition around the Stanley Cup and the Stanley Cup Finals, more so than any other league in my opinion. And also there's some, they place the right focus in my opinion on divisions and conferences. And rivalries. There's just a lot to it, which is pretty cool. And so you'll see that being played out here as we talk about the rankings. But let's go ahead and get started. Coming in at number 32, we have the Columbus Blue Jackets. So the Blue Jackets, we're already starting off with some expansion teams. They joined the NHL as the 29th and 30th teams alongside Minnesota, the Minnesota Wild. I don't know who was technically considered first, but they were the 29th and 30th teams. They started their first seasons in 2001 season, but it took them 8 seasons to actually make the playoffs. They were in the Central Division in the Western Conference, but then there was some conference realignment after some more expansion teams, and they got moved to the Metropolitan Division in the Eastern Conference. And it was there when they finally actually won their first playoff game. Their first one round that they made the playoffs, they actually were swept by the Detroit Red Wings. But then when they made the playoffs in 2013, that's when they won their first playoff game. The lost the first round in 6 games to the Penguins. But they did have a pretty good stretch there from the 16-17 season to the 19-20 season where they had 4 straight playoff appearances, but they haven't made it past the game 6 of the second round. They've never won their division and they've never finished higher than third. So that's why we have them down here. They actually fell down one from being 31st, or actually, spoiler alert, they were 30th, and we can guess who might have vaulted above them here in a second. Coming in at number 31, we have the New York Islanders. The Islanders is one historic franchise that I never knew about because their glory years were long after or long before I was born. By the time that I came around, the Islanders were a abysmal franchise. They only made the playoffs 3 times um, during the first decade of my life, so in the 90s. And like I said, back then, the majority of teams made the playoffs. So they only making the playoffs 3 times is pretty sad. They experienced a 21-year drought where they failed to advance in the Stanley Cup playoffs, and they have started to become a little bit more relevant and consistent here recently. They even advanced to the Eastern Conference Finals in 2020. But still, yeah, they have not won their division. They were surpassed by one team as well here. But hopefully, maybe they can climb the rankings now that they have had a little bit more success. Next up, we're going to play a game called Who Wants to Have the History of the Lackluster Winnipeg Jets from 1990 to 1996? And the winner goes to the Arizona Coyotes, coming in at number 30. The Coyotes technically retain the past history of the original Winnipeg Jets that relocated to Phoenix and became known as the Phoenix Coyotes in 1996. During the entire history of the Coyotes' stay in Arizona, though, there's been constant speculation of whether or not they can actually stay in the heat of the desert. The team did have to file for bankruptcy in 2009, which led to the NHL assuming control of the team. And maybe they should have retained control of the team because in 2012, the Coyotes actually had their best season ever in franchise history, winning their only division title and making it to the Game 5 of the Western Conference Finals. This was the only time that the Coyotes have made it out of the first round. With the purchase of the team, the Coyotes changed their name from Phoenix to the Arizona Coyotes and have only made the playoffs once in the past 11 years. They've fallen down 2 spots and are actually surpassed by the next uh, other Winnipeg Jets team. We'll jump right into it, number 29. And while the Arizona team gets to keep the irrelevant history of the Jets, franchise, it's not much better for the Winnipeg Jets to retain the history of the inept franchise that was once called the Atlanta Thrashers. The Thrashers were the 28th team to join in the league in 1999, but during its brief 11-year stint in Atlanta, the franchise made the playoffs once and didn't win a single playoff game. Due to many struggling factors, but most notably lack of fan support, Winnipeg was rewarded a second chance to resurrect their franchise, and the Jets were reborn to start the 2011-2012 season. The Jets also would move from the Eastern Conference to the Western Conference during the great 2013-14 realignment and have made the playoffs 7 of the 10 playoffs years since. Coming in at number 28, we have the newest franchise, the Seattle Kraken. The Kraken are the newest franchise in the NHL and just completed their second year in the league. They were number 32 last year because they did not make the playoffs and didn't really have a great season their first year. They didn't quite get some of the benefits that the Vegas Golden Knights did during their expansion, but they have improved and shown that they are a force to be reckoned with right out of the gate, making the playoffs in their second year and actually upsetting the defending champion Colorado Avalanche. So if this becomes a consistent thing, you can look to see them vault up the rankings because of the way my expansion rule works. They could see themselves gaining traction pretty quickly. Coming in at number 27, we have the Edmonton Oilers. The team of the 80s started to feel their downturn as the turn of the 90s came. They lost their legend Wayne Gretzky, but they still had ended up having Mark Messier on their team, and that was this was the first team to win a Stanley Cup after I was born. I was born right before the playoffs started, and so that technically counts because I was alive during that time. The Oilers remained relevant for the next couple of years, but ultimately faded like most dominant teams. And in fact, this team is actually the only team in the bottom 12 of my rankings who have won a Stanley Cup. The Oilers would make an inspiring run back to the Stanley Cup Finals after the NHL lockout season in 2004-2005. At least that's when the lockout was, and they would return during the 05-06 season, but fell short to the Carolina Hurricanes. An 11-year playoff drought would follow that, but fortune favored the Oilers when they won the draft lottery in 2015 and were able to select Connor McDavid to help jumpstart their franchise. Since then, the Oilers have made the playoffs 5 of the last 8 times, but the closest they've gotten was getting swept in the 2022 Western Conference Finals. They are another team that has not yet won their division in my lifetime, and they fell one spot from this season. Coming in at number 26, we have the Buffalo Sabres. The Sabres did struggle to have success in the early part of the 90s, but sort of found a stride in the later half. From 1996 to 2001, they made the playoffs every single year and even made a Stanley Cup Finals run in the 98-99 season. After a brief rebuilding phase, the Sabres had another outstanding run in 2005-2006 and are the lowest ranked team to have at least one President's Trophy. Right now, they are currently suffering a 12-year playoff drought, though, and also fell one spot from this ranking. The team that surpassed the Oilers and the Sabres, coming in at number 25, are the Florida Panthers. Alongside the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, the Florida Panthers were the 25th and 26th teams admitted to the NHL and began their first season during the 93-94 season. The Panthers actually made a surprising run to the Stanley Cup Finals during their third year, but for the next 22 years, they had only 4 playoff appearances and didn't even make it out of the first round. The Panthers have recently gone through a resurgence, though, and have made the playoffs the past 4 years, including a dominating President's Cup trophy run in 2022. And then most recently, they eked into the playoffs as an 8 team, upset the number 1 Boston Bruins, and made it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals again. This past season's performance is what have them jumping up the 2 spots. Coming in at number 24, we have the Toronto Maple Leafs. The history of the Toronto Maple Leafs since the 1990s can be summarized quickly as a team that has consistently underperformed in the playoffs. The Leafs have more playoff appearances than seven teams ranked above them, but they only have two division titles to show for it. In 2005, the NHL introduced a salary cap that impacted the Leafs' ability to spend on players, and there then was 11 years where they only made the playoffs once. This year marked the seventh straight playoff appearance for the Leafs, but this year was the first year that they were able to make it out of the first round. You can hardly consider that consolation, though, considering they were heavy favorites again against the previously mentioned Panthers, but ultimately fell short. Next up, we have the Ottawa Senators coming in at number 23. After going 60 years without an NHL team, Ottawa was finally awarded another expansion team that started playing during the 92-93 season. It didn't take Ottawa long before they became a consistent playoff team, including a 20-year span from 1997 to 2017 where they only missed the playoffs four times. However, they seem to have been bitten by the same bug as their other Canadian partner, as they just can't quite seem to get over the hump. What has this team separated from Toronto is that they have a President's Trophy Cup in 2003 and a Stanley Cup's finals run in 2007. But while Toronto is on the rise, Ottawa has been stumbling for a while now as they've missed the playoffs in the past six seasons. Surpassing the Ottawa Senators at number 22, we have the Minnesota Wild. The state of Minnesota fortunately didn't have to wait as long as the city of Ottawa had to before getting a team to root for. After the North Stars left in 1993 to become the Dallas Stars, the state of Minnesota was promised that they would soon get an expansion return to their state, and that happened in 2001. The deepest playoff run for the Wild came during their third season, where they made it to the Western Conference Finals before being swept by the eventual champion Ducks. It's a little sad that out of their 13 playoff appearances, they've only made it past the first round three times, but 10 playoff appearances in the past 11 years still could be something to be happy about. At number 21, we'll continue on with some more Canadian teams. We have the Calgary Flames. The Flames have a fun history during my lifetime, culminating in streaks of playoff appearances, followed by streaks of playoff droughts, and then ending with a decade of postseason appearances every other year. The Flames were the defending champions when I was born, but never did quite make it back to the finals. After seven straight playoff absences, the Flames did return with the deep playoff run, including making it back to the Stanley Cup Finals before losing to the Lightning in a heartbreaking seven-game series. The most promising team since that Stanley Cup team was just here recently during the 21-22 season, but were ultimately ousted by their Canadian rival Oilers in the second round. At number 20, we have the Carolina Hurricanes, known as the Hartford Whalers until relocating to Carolina for the 1997-98 season. The Hurricanes finally started to reach a turning point when they took the division in 1999, but were ousted in the first round. They would make their first Stanley Cup Finals run 3 years later, but were quickly dispatched by the Detroit Red Wings. After the lockout season, they would emerge as the top team by capturing their first and only title of my lifetime, knocking out the Oilers in a dramatic seven-game series. The team would not maintain that success, though, however, and outside a lone Eastern Conference final appearance 3 years later, the Hurricanes would miss the playoffs 11 out of the next 12 years. The Hurricanes have reemerged, though, as one of the top teams in the NHL, capturing the last three division titles. However, they were also one of the teams that ran into the Florida buzzsaw this year. And even though I'm a little newer on the scene to following the NHL, I actually root for quite a few teams. But the one that I have tended to root for the longest is the San Jose Sharks, and they are coming in at number 19. Sadly, they're pretty far down this list, even though they have had a ton of playoff appearances. It's a shame that two of my favorite professional sports teams mirror each other so similarly for negative reasons, like the Jazz. Only six teams during my lifetime have made the playoffs more times than the San Jose Sharks, but the Sharks only have one Stanley Cup Finals appearance to show for it. The Sharks were the 22nd expansion team in the NHL and the first one after I was born. Even during their expansion years, the Sharks never had a playoff drought longer than 2 years until their current 4 year drought. The Sharks had two golden stretches and opportunities to hoist the Stanley Cup. From 2008 to 2011, they were one of the more dominant teams in the NHL, even hoisting the President's Trophy in 2009. Then, from 2016, with a team of Thornton, Pavelski, and Burns, the Sharks were able to get to 6 games in the Stanley Cup, but one appearance is all they have to show for that. With an old and depleted roster, this team has fallen to the depths of rebuilding, and I don't think they're going to be getting up anytime soon. Surpassing the Sharks this year, we have the Nashville Predators coming in at number 18. And it's interesting that these two are so close together in the rankings because they boast very similar resumes and histories. The only difference is that the Predators are a little bit younger of a team, meaning that their success has garnered a little bit more points for them. As the 27th expansion franchise, the Predators started their first season in the 98-99 season. It did take them a little bit longer to get going than the Sharks did, but since their first playoff appearance in 2004, they've only missed the playoffs 4 other times. The Predators had their most success immediately following the Sharks' Stanley Cup Finals run after losing to the Sharks in Game 7 of the Western Conference Finals. The Predators made it all the way to the finals in 2017, but had a similar fate and fell to the Penguins in 6 games. The Predators maintained dominance by picking up the 2018 President's Trophy, but ultimately fell short in the second round. The Predators since then have been a middle of the road team. Coming in at number 17, we have another California team that is slipping down the rankings, and that's the Anaheim Ducks. I love the story of the Anaheim Ducks, a franchise team created by Disney and named after one of my favorite movie series growing up. The Mighty Ducks of Anaheim started playing as an expansion franchise in the 93-94 season. The Mighty Ducks had a taste of success early, and by their 10th season, they were already making a surprising Cinderella run to the Stanley Cup Finals as a 7th seed. The Mighty Ducks took the New Jersey Devils to 7 games, but ultimately fell short, even though they won all of their home games. I'm pretty disappointed that they did change their logo and their names. They dropped the Mighty from the name and are now just called the Ducks. But I guess fans can't really complain too much because after that happened, the new look Ducks returned to the Stanley Cup Finals after bolstering up their roster to become one of the favorites during the 2006 2007 season. This time, the Ducks finished the job beating the Ottawa Senators. The Ducks remained relevant after that and quite dominant, actually. They captured 5 straight Pacific titles from 2013 to 2017, but they never could quite get back to the Stanley Cup finals. Since over the past 5 years, though, they have been sliding and have been one of the worst teams in the NHL. And wrapping up the state of California, we have the Los Angeles Kings coming in at number 16. The biggest of NHL fans will know Wayne Gretzky for what he did for the Edmonton Oilers franchise, but by the time I was born, Gretzky found himself on the LA Kings. Gretzky immediately turned this franchise around by the late 80s, and it's not very often that you see a franchise actually have more Stanley Cups than they do division titles, but that's what we have here with the LA Kings. The LA Kings' only division title came during the first full year of my lifetime. With Gretzky, the Kings did make it to the Stanley Cup Finals once in the 92-93 season, but ultimately fell to the Canadiens. For the next 20-ish years, the Kings weren't very relevant, even going bankrupt at one point, leading to the departure of a lot of their high profile players, including Gretzky. The Kings would then reach their dominant era in the early teens when in 2012 they became the only 8 seed to ever win the Stanley Cup. During their title defense, they made it all the way to the Western Conference Finals but fell to the Blackhawks. However, they did return again during the 13-14 season and became just the fourth NHL team in history at that time to come back from a 3-0 deficit when they beat my cursed Sharks in the first round. The Kings would move on and eventually claim their second title in 3 years. Since that season, the Kings have not made any serious postseason run and has not made it out of the second round since. However, their playoff appearance and the slide of the Ducks have them surpassing them up to number 16. At number 15, we have the Philadelphia Flyers. I'll be the first to claim that I don't know a ton of history about the Philadelphia Flyers, but with that said, growing up, I always knew that this team was a pretty solid and consistent playoff team. And that's probably the best way to describe this team. During the 90s, the Flyers were a consistent playoff contender. They even made it to the Stanley Cup Finals in 1997. And from that 97 season to the lockouts, they were still a regular playoff team, but never quite made a deep playoff postseason run. However, after the lockout season, they were back in as serious contenders and made the Stanley Cup Finals again in 2010 before losing to the Blackhawks. Since that Stanley Cup Finals appearance, they have slowly regressed. They started my lifetime with a 5 year playoff drought and have currently missed the playoff the last 3 seasons. At number 14, we have the Montreal Canadiens. While it would take a decade straight of the Toronto Maple Leafs winning the Stanley Cup just to get even within one of the amount that the Canadiens have, you can say that the Canadiens haven't seemed to have done as well now that there's more teams to contend with. The Canadiens did start off the 90s era, though, pretty strong, winning the Stanley Cup in the 92-93 season. The Canadians boast a ton of playoff appearances and no playoff drought longer than 3 years, but the Canadians have also only made it to the conference finals or further 4 times. The most memorable one came just recently in the 2021 season. With a COVID shortened season, the Canadians were reshuffled into a Canada only division, sparking some fun Canadian rivalries. The Canadians snuck into the playoffs as the team with the least amount of points. The Canadians made that Cinderella run all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, but were ultimately ousted in 5 games against the Lightning. The Canadians have been towards the bottom of the standings since that time. Coming in at number 13, we have the final Canadian team, the Vancouver Canucks, who are also the highest ranked team on this list that does not have a Stanley Cup championship. I'm still surprised that they're up this high up this list because they've had quite a few streaks of inadequacy. The Canucks have missed the playoffs 7 of the last 8 years, and the lone appearance was during that COVID season. They have reached Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals both in 1994 and in 2011. Their golden era was from 2003 to 2013, and during that decade, the Canucks dominated the inadequate Northwest Division, but still played well enough to have back to back President trophies, more so than 5 other teams ahead of them on this list. Jumping to number 12, we have the St. Louis Blues. The Blues slid back just 2 spots after missing the playoffs for only the 7th time during my lifetime. The Blues are tied for second in playoff appearances during my lifetime with 26 of them. The Blues have only been a top 3 seed only 9 of those times, though. So the lack of division titles and deep postseasons runs is what has this team just sitting outside the top 10. However, the Blues did pull off one of my favorite comeback stories of my brief NHL knowledge. In January of the 2018-19 season, the Blues were sitting in last place in the entire NHL. However, they went on a tear during the final 3 months of the season and wound up as the fifth seed in the Western Conference. They used their season momentum to go all the way and claim their first Stanley Cup of my lifetime. I was rooting for them as a fan of many teams that lacked postseason success. Coming in at number 11, we have the New York Rangers. The Rangers started out my lifetime with some popular players on their roster, like Mark Messier, who helped them win their first Stanley Cup in 54 years when they did so in 1994. Other than a 7 year stretch from 1997 to 2003, the Rangers have always been a consistent playoff team, never having a drought longer than 2 years. During the 2010 decade is when the Rangers started returning to making deep playoff runs, including a Stanley Cup Finals appearance in 2014, where they eventually fell to the Kings. The following season, the Rangers, picked as one of the favorites, took home the President's Trophy, but ultimately fell in Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals to the Tampa Bay Lightning. And speaking of the Tampa Bay Lightning, they start off our top 10 here. As an expansion team that started playing in the 92-93 season, the Lightning's first 10 seasons were quite a disaster that had ownership of the team marred in controversy and Japanese yakuzas, if you can believe that. Since the turn of the century, the Lightning have been a solid team and have thrived in the league through strategic planning, even taking advantage of the injured reserve to help them win their most recent Stanley Cup. The Lightning boast 3 Stanley Cups and 5 final appearances in just the past 21 years. Their most impressive stretch has come just recently, where they had back to back titles in 20 and 21, and then returned to the finals again in 22 before falling to the Avalanche. At number 9, we have the Dallas Stars. As mentioned before, the Minnesota Wild wasn't the first franchise that played hockey in the state up north. Before the Wild, there was the Minnesota North Stars. This franchise was still around during my lifetime and even boasted an appearance in the Stanley Cup Finals during the 90-91 season. The North Stars even flirted with the idea of moving to Anaheim before Mickey Mouse stepped in and was awarded his franchise. Instead, they decided to head more south central and drop the name North from their Stars name. The Stars have been consistently relevant franchise. They enjoyed immediate success after relocating, including a 3 year span where in 1998 they made it to Game 6 of the Western Conference Finals. 1999 they took home the Stanley Cup, and in 2000 lost in Game 6 of the Stanley Cup Finals to the New Jersey Devils. The Stars have continued to enjoy pretty good success, minus a 5 year playoff drought from 2009 to 13. Most recently, they found themselves back in the Stanley Cup Finals during the COVID year and just gave the Golden Knights a compelling 6 game series in last year's playoffs. At number 8, we have the Chicago Blackhawks. The Blackhawks started out the 90s trying to rid themselves of disappointing playoff failures. After suffering a Game 6 defeat to the eventual champion Oilers, the Blackhawks were stunned in the 90-91 season by being beaten out of the first round, even though they had claimed the President's Trophy that year. The Hawks would rebound from that disappointing season and finally make it to the Stanley Cup Finals in the 91-92 season, but were ultimately swept by the Penguins, who were looking to repeat. The Hawks continued to make the playoffs through the early part of the 90s, but never got closer to Game 5 of the Western Conference Finals. The Blackhawks would then slip into obscurity and go through a decade where they only made the playoffs one time. The golden era of Blackhawks hockey came in 2007, where they were able to draft Jonathan Taves, and then just a short time later pick up Patrick Kane. These two players, amongst other contributors, started off that 6 years of dominance from 2009 to 2015, where they won 3 Stanley Cup finals, including a blistering start in 2012 to 2013, where they started the season 21-0-3. The Blackhawks have regressed again, though, and have missed the playoffs 5 of the last 6 years. Fortune favored them as they won the NHL lottery this past year and were able to nab Connor Bedard. Will he return the franchise back to its dominance like Taves and Kane? At number 7, we have the Washington Capitals. The Capitals have always been a very consistent playoff team. They made it to the conference finals during the 89-90 season, the first year that I was alive, but they would not get closer to the Stanley Cup until their appearance in the 97-98 season, where they were swept by the unstoppable Detroit Red Wings. From the 98-99 season to the 2006-2007 season, the Capitals either missed the playoffs or were eliminated during the first round. Once Ovechkin hit his stride, the Capitals became a dominating regular season team, and the Capitals took home 10 division titles during a 13-year stretch. For a decade, Capitals fans suffered heartache after heartache, most notably during the back to back President Cup seasons, where they were stymied short by their conference rival Penguins in 2016 and 2017. However, Ovechkin and the Caps were finally able to redeem themselves in 2018 when they took home their only cup, beating the inaugural Golden Knights. At number 6, we have the New Jersey Devils. The Devils were just in their infant stages of consistently making the playoffs by the time I was born. But during the 90s, 2000s, and 2000, early part of the 2010s, that's when the New Jersey Devils really dominated. Behind Hall of Famer and arguably one of the best goalies of all time, Martin Brodeur, the Devils dominated those 3 decades with 5 Stanley Cup appearances and 3 titles. The most impressive stretch was from 1999 to 2003, where they had 3 Stanley Cup Finals appearances and 2 cups. After their finals appearance in 2012, they slipped into inadequacy and have only reached the playoffs twice since then. But one of those appearances was this most recent year, so maybe they are back trying to return to glory. At number 5, we have the Boston Bruins. It may be slightly controversial to have the Bruins ahead of the Devils because even though the Bruins have had so many dominant seasons, they only have 1 Stanley Cup during my lifetime. The Bruins ended the first regular season of my lifetime after I was born with the overall best record and rode that record all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals before they were ousted by the Edmonton Oilers. However, the other 3 President Trophy winning seasons actually ended in bitter disappointment. First, it was in the 13-14 season when they lost in the second round to the Canadiens. Then, in the 1920 season, they lost to the Lightning in the second round. And then finally, this most recent season where they won the President's Trophy and blew a 3-1 lead to the 8 seeded Florida Panthers. The Bruins do have a thrilling Game 7 Stanley Cup Finals win over the Mighty Ducks in 2011 to hang their hat on. Otherwise, fans may really be reeling from their playoff disappointments this team has experienced. Coming in at number 4, we have the Colorado Avalanche. Let me tell you, I think that hockey actually has some of the better mascot names out of all of the sports. Before the Colorado Avalanche, which I think is already a pretty cool name, they were known as the Quebec Nordiques. And they were known as that until relocating to Colorado during the 1995-96 season. The Nordiques fans out there are probably still bitter after what happened when the Avalanche relocated because the first season that they were in Colorado, they went all the way and took the Stanley Cup with dominating players like Joe Sakic, Peter Forsberg, and Patrick Raw. This was a team that I loved to root for in the 90s because they were close to my home and didn't know too much about the Sharks then. It was the Avalanche that we always liked to cheer for. The Avalanche remained dominant through the late part of the 90s and early 2000s and even captured another title in 2001. During their first 7 seasons in Colorado, they made it to the conference finals or further 6 of those times. After all of their stars left, though, they did continue to remain relevant and were making the playoffs, but not nearly as threatening as they were before. Colorado then entered a rebuilding phase where they missed the playoffs 6 out of the 7 years, starting in the early 2010s. But the Avalanche did return to the postseason in 2018, and they've made the playoffs every year since then. They had a dominating playoff run in 2022 where they went 16-4 to capture their third Stanley Cup. The Coming in at number 3, we have the Pittsburgh Penguins. With one of the best players of all time in Mario Lemieux, they started out the 90s by being dominant and taking home back to back titles in the 90-91 season and the 91-92 season. But as Lemieux's health started to deteriorate, so did the Penguins as a franchise. 4 of their 6 Penguins playoff absences came during a stretch from 2001 to 2006, but that drought actually allowed them to be able to go in and draft their next franchise player, Sidney Crosby. And after a few years of him getting to the used to it, Sidney Crosby did help finally return the Penguins to their former glory. First in back in 2008 when they were able to make it to the Stanley Cup Finals where they lost to the Detroit Red Wings. They were able to then avenge that Stanley Cup Finals loss the very next year by beating the Red Wings again, this time in a dramatic 7-game series. The Penguins continued to be a dangerous team in the playoffs, but once again took home back to back titles in 2016 over the Sharks and then 2017 over the Predators, cementing them as one of the most dominant teams of my lifetime. In fact, they are the franchise that does have the most Stanley Cup finals over the past 33 years. And at number 2, we have the Detroit Red Wings. The Red Wings were such a dominant force in the 90s and 2000s with Steve Yzerman and the Russian Five. The Red Wings started their 15-year stretch of dominance in the 1994 season when they won the President's Trophy and made it to the Stanley Cup Finals. However, I think the stage was a little bit too bright for them as they were swept by the Devils in the finals. The Red Wings would take home back to back President trophies the following year, but were upset in the conference finals by the champion Avalanche. The Red Wings would finally capture their first title in 40 plus years and take home 2 in back to back seasons. They would follow up with another title in just 4 years in 2002. They continued to be a contender throughout the 2000s, winning 3 more President's Trophies, the third one culminating in their fourth Stanley Cup against the Penguins. As mentioned previously, they would make it back to the Stanley Cup Finals the following year and face the same Penguins team, but this time the Penguins would prevail. Even though the Penguins have more Stanley Cup victories than the Red Wings, I have them listed as number 2 because of the sheer dominance during those 15-year stretch. They had 11 division titles during that time, a whopping 6 President trophies, and it's quite surprising that they've been able to hold off the Penguins, especially considering the Red Wings have dipped into obscurity, failing to reach the playoffs since 2016. I remember the first time when they announced that, and they said that was the first time since 1990 that they had missed the playoffs. So, other than that 89-90 season where they missed the playoffs then, they had not missed the playoffs for my entire lifetime until 2016. We'll see how long they'll be able to hold off the Penguins if they continue to slide. And because of maybe that Detroit Red Wings slide is the only reason why I might have this team as my number 1 team. Probably the most controversial, especially for all of you traditional hockey fans. But coming in at number 1, we have the Vegas Golden Knights. And I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this controversial take, but according to the way I do my lifetime power rankings, they are here at the number 1 team. Before you close down this video and send out rude comments, please understand that I know that this appears flawed. How can a franchise team that has only been in existence for 6 years already be at number 1 as a lifetime power rankings? Well, like I said before, the nature of my rankings is based on points that are typically cumulative in nature, and this gives the expansion teams, especially new ones, a severe disadvantage. And so the only way that I can do it is by doing a per year average. So when you have an expansion franchise like the Golden Knights, who have made the playoffs 83% of the time that they've been in existence, won their division 50% of the time, and have already made it to the Stanley Cup finals twice, including one victory, it's hard to keep them out. Now, do I think the Golden Knights are going to be able to sustain this success over the next 30 years? Absolutely not. In fact, the Golden Knights could win 50 games and make the playoffs next year, and their gap between them and the Red Wings would still shrink. It does have the capability of getting a little bit closer, so don't fret, my friends. It will balance itself out. But let's just give this team some credit where it's due. The Golden Knights did benefit from a generous expansion draft, but they also used some cunning tactics to, you know, trade away or take draft picks from these other franchises in order to not take some of the teams that they wanted to protect. And then the players that they did take were all, still pretty decent players and feeling gypped by the team that did not protect them. They outperformed than what anyone thought that they would have expected. They've been a lot of fun to watch, and Vegas actually has become starting to become one of my favorite teams. I know I'm probably a bandwagoner, but they are the team that actually geography is in closest proximity to me, and the Sharks are terrible right now. So we'll be rooting for the Vegas Golden Knights as well. And fun fact too is I was actually there at a convention when they won their Stanley Cup Finals here recently. So it was kind of fun being down there celebrating with all of the fans there. So there you have it. That's my rankings. I know they might be a little bit controversial, and sorry if it ended in disappointment for some of you true purist NHL fans, but that's where I have it. We'll update this next year and see if the Golden Knights can reclaim and keep that number one spot, or if another team supplants them. Again, these rankings are just for fun. We're out here just having fun and chatting about sports, which is something I love to do. So thanks again for watching. Thank you for making it this far. If you have any comments, tell me what you think. Put them in the comments. What you like, dislike. What would you change? How would you rank your teams? I'd love to hear it. Love to keep the conversation going. NBA is up next. We'll get started on that, and happy to get going on that because we do have some interesting rankings there as well. But until then, thanks for watching, guys. Take care.